My dad sent me a clip, I think it was last night, where he just saw this on TV and was like, oh, how the hell is this being produced? Because it's just race propaganda, and we'll get into it because it's not surprising that the BBC would produce such a thing. But this, let's just call it like mini documentary. It's like an hour long of him exploring why is COVID killing people of colour? And you'll notice there the American phrase "people of color" that no Englishman uses.
Yes,
we would use blacks or
BAME
or something like this if you want to be politically correct, or you would just call it blacks, Asians, so on and so forth, right? You wouldn't use people of color. It's not in British parlance. But he wants to find out, and it is a thing that has been taking place. So, I mean, the fact that people who have brown skin, let's say, because to be honest, I think that's an easier way of putting it as well. Sounds less like I'm trying to chug garbage water or something. Like, it doesn't sound like English, people of colour.
Yeah, no, it's awful.
So I'm just going to say people with brown skin instead. So this is the first clip I want to play, which is him going to an area.
Maybe we should just say non-white. Just to...
I don't know. It's a minefield. I'm just going to use brown skin because it's what Magic Now uses.
Oh, okay.
I think it's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
So this is the first clip of him going somewhere and trying to find out what's going on.
This is Church End in the borough of Brent, northwest London. In this small neighbourhood, 36 people lost their lives to COVID during the first wave of the pandemic. A death rate 5 times the national average. Almost 65% of the population in Brent are of Black African, Afro-Caribbean, Pakistani, Bangladeshi or other minority ethnic origin.
65%.
How long has this market been here, Mohammed?
Oh, over 20 years.
Only 20
You really
years.
see the diversity here.
Everybody's here. Africans, and Caribbean, Asians. Everybody come to this market to sell their wares, you know?
When I became aware of the news reports that this seemed to be taking a disproportionate collateral damage on black and ethnic minorities, I got worried because I suddenly thought, well, what's the reason behind that?
The initial phase, it was very much just a wall footing where you just kind of dealt with the patients in front of you, but it was a gradual realisation as you walked around the ITU and just looked at the vast numbers of patients here, and that largely it wasn't the white population who were getting COVID.
Wow.
But also, we noticed that the people we tended to meet with COVID tended to have 1 or 2 comorbidities. Not significant comorbidities, high blood pressure, diabetes. And from our point of view, they were relatively well patients and they were being admitted to intensive care, acutely unwell and fighting for their lives.
So I just find that interesting. I mean, first, there's an area called Brent, in which 65% of the population are brown-skinned, because I don't want to use this weird parlance of people of colour.
Yeah.
And then the doctor at the local hospital says, well, the most people we brought in who were severe all had brown skin. And it was like, well, I mean, that would make sense if over the, what would you call it? Majority? Yeah, it's more than the majority have brown skin. Well, yeah, okay, well, I don't know what the surprise is there.
It's nearly 2/3.
And saying that the people who went to the ICU were those who had comorbidities. So it's people who have, I don't know what to call it, already illnesses.
Well, people who aren't in exactly great
existing
shape.
Conditions.
Yeah, people who are overweight, have diabetes, smoke too much, drink too much, whatever it is.
And that seems, I mean, I would have just ended the documentary there, to be honest. To be like, right, well, I went to an area in which is mostly brown people. Went in, they said, yeah, it's because people are, have existing
Aren't taking
conditions.
care of themselves.
Yeah, and then that would have been it. We have an authority from the hospital.
What else do you have to say?
And he's like, no, I wonder what is really going on. And he asked, how could a virus discriminate like this?
But just as a quick thing before we go on, that market thing has kind of annoyed me. It's like, oh, this market's been here for 20 years. Yeah, about 4 or 5 years after Tony Blair came to power. Right, and then suddenly mass immigration begins, and that
area is 65%.
And now it's 60. So in 20 years, Tony Blair's mass immigration policy has totally changed the demographic makeup of that area.
Because I mean, did that seem like an English market?
No, of course not.
Because English markets do exist.
Yeah, of course they do. I know. I mean, we live in the West Country. We know what English markets are like.
But just for any people who haven't been to England.
Yeah, they're not the same, and it's just such a strikingly obvious example of how Tony Blair's immigration policy has just completely changed how Britain is.
Yeah. I want to play this clip. This is just him saying, how could a virus discriminate this in the response to being told how it does?
The fact that so many seriously ill COVID patients here were black or Asian and also had comorbidities or underlying health conditions is really scary because that's me. Well, how could an illness discriminate
You're not,
like
though.
this?
You obviously don't have diabetes.
No, he does have some existing conditions.
Oh, does he? Right.
But he's just like, this is so interesting because it's me. And it's like, yeah, of course, that's why you're interested in it. Okay.
But I mean, he lives in fairly good health.
But then at the end, you talked over it, but he's saying, how could a virus discriminate like this? I was like, it doesn't. It doesn't, mate. It just acts as it does because it's a virus.
It affects everyone, and it depends on what you're personally like. So if you're in good condition and you're not, I don't know, smoking, drinking, and very overweight, you'll probably be all right.
Yeah, and he spends the rest of the documentary essentially being told this over and over again, where it's just like different people who have got the hard data. Like I cut out a bunch of stuff where he's talking to, random people or to his subjective viewpoint or their subjective viewpoint, because I don't think that's very useful. I watched Trevor Phillips on trigonometry, shout out, because that was an amazing episode. And the way he goes at things is just look at the hard data and then make your views on it, which is, I think, is right. So then it's just people giving him hard data on this. So this is just the first one here, showing that BAME people make up a higher percentage of ICU and mortality within ICUs.
So if we look at the table that they've got up there, you'll see that 86% of the population in England and Wales are considered white, which means that the remaining 14% are people of colour, like you and me. So from that, you'd expect that the people who are going to be hardest hit are going to be white people, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, during the first wave, people of colour accounted for 34% of all patients admitted to intensive care, which is more than twice what you'd expect.
And we know that the people who are entering ICU units are the most serious cases, right?
Absolutely.
So it would say that not only are the numbers disproportionate, but the effects of the COVID are disproportionately affecting people of colour.
Absolutely. It's hitting us hardest. The ONS also looked at whether your ethnicity put you at greater risk of dying from COVID than a white person of the same age. And if you look at this next graph, what you'll see is that the results are actually quite staggering, because it's showing you that it's not white people who are most at risk of dying from COVID-19. So the white population are there right at the bottom. Mm-hmm. Now, to me, this graph is bad news for people like you and me. I'm of Indian origin. So if you look at where I'm on the graph, I'm twice as likely to die from COVID as my white friends.
And if I look at this graph, I am 3 times more likely to die of COVID.
So this is just hard data showing that people who have brown skin have different percentages of morbidity, and also the people who make it into the ICUs. Yeah. So it's not that white people aren't catching it. It's that what they're arguing here is that everyone's catching it, but those who end up in hospitals disproportionately seem to be those of brown skin.
I just despise hearing people with such posh accents try to pretend like they're an oppressed minority.
Yeah, it's really weird, isn't it?
Yeah, you're not oppressed. I mean, if you've got an accent like that, you were privileged, so shut up.
Like, this guy's a famous actor in the UK, running a show for the BBC here. I'm just like...
I mean, that woman's accent was sublime, absolutely crisp. I wonder when she went to university.
Yeah. But you've wondered about this, and a lot of people have been wondering about this. Well, it could one of the reasons be vitamin D. And he goes to Queen Mary Hospital, and they confirm, this isn't just press rumours. Like, we are looking at whether or not, because you have darker pigment, therefore you're not getting enough sunshine in the winter years, and so forth.
Well, I saw one study that showed that apparently sub-Saharan Africans had 50% lower vitamin D levels in Britain than the average white English person. And presumably that is because of the geographic location of England.
Yeah, this isn't just some, Daily Mail or internet thing. The people at Queen Mary's Queen Mary's University are confirming that they are looking into this. So let's just play it.
What we're trying to do here at Queen Mary is find out whether vitamin D supplementation can boost immunity to respiratory viruses and bacteria. One virus in particular we're interested in, of course, is SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID-19.
So that's essentially where the sort of rumour came in that it was vitamin D that was sort of a vitamin D deficiency that was the cause of COVID having such an impact in the black community.
Well, I don't think it's likely that vitamin D is going to be the single cause. At best, it's going to be one part of the puzzle. And it's a complex puzzle with a whole load of biological and social factors mixing in to cause those effects.
I mean, already we're running into a problem here. People looking at things like, what's the single cause? It's like, okay, no.
Yeah.
It's not how this works. There's going to be a bunch of things that add up.
But he's looking for a single cause.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, like, one of the things, the contributing factors that was probably true, in my opinion, is the difference in sort of family life. You get many generations in a single household. COVID spreads to older people who are more vulnerable to it easily, and if they're, I don't know, covered up, or if they have dark skin, so they have lower amount of vitamin D, and so lower immune response to it, like we're saying. Like, you've got all of these sort of like factors that add up, and then if you add in like, I hate to say it, but the Afro-Caribbean community in Britain is the most obese community in Britain. If you look at the data, they've got the highest rates there, and it's that sort of thing. So the next thing here is sort of what you're talking about. So this is them saying hard data, population density, jobs chosen. This is a huge impact on it. So this play.
So in London, for example, ethnic minorities comprise about 34% of the population, and yet they form almost half of the people who are involved in health work like me, more than half of the people who are involved in food production, and almost half of people who are transport workers.
Front-facing key worker roles.
Exactly. Black workers are often more at risk because you're on the front line and you're in those places where you can actually catch coronavirus in the first place.
Right.
You just gotta go over how he sat there being told, like, endlessly by people who've got the hard data, this is why. You know, people working in front line roles are disproportionately.
But the thing is, I don't even agree that that's going to be disproportionate, because I bet that, I mean, their data about who's working in the buses is going to be from like 20. Or, no, the data from the working in the buses is going to be like 2019 transport data or something like that. But they're using census data from 2010. And I'm absolutely certain that this year's census is going to be an absolute shock to people.
Yeah. There is also something to mention here. There's a little bit of footsie going on throughout this whole thing, which they sometimes use ethnic minorities as a standard. Sometimes they use Black Asian as a standard, which excludes other groups.
Excludes Germans and French.
Sometimes they use people of color, and I don't know why they keep changing it. Like, surely you'd want to try
have
and keep
a
it
consistent standard,
But whatever. And then they go on to say here about, frontline NHS, there's also a disproportionality in people dying there. So it might not just be that you're working frontline, it might be a genetic problem here. So just play.
Black and Asian people, we form 14% of the population, and yet we actually make up 21% of the NHS workforce. So a little bit more than you might expect. And yet 63% of health workers who have died from this disease are from those groups. People of colour, we are 44% of all the doctors in the NHS, and yet of all the doctors who have died from coronavirus, 95% are people of colour.
So they're showing here that even if we have X percentage of people who have brown skin, they're still dying at a higher rate than the white workers in similar conditions. So they're saying, well, like you're saying, it might be about vitamin D, comorbidities and whatnot.
It's going to be a combination of all of these
It's not just
things.
about the job, although that is a contributing factor. And then they go on to talk about this sort of thing, and he just can't take it. He thinks that, no, this is because of racism. So just to play.
You know, it's really quite depressing, actually, when you think about it. But the racism that was around when my parents first arrived in the country is pretty much still with us today, you know? Study after study will tell you that Black and Asian people feel that they probably won't get the job that they want and will probably be passed over for a promotion simply because of their race.
And what, so they'll be relegated to working at the NHS, will they?
Relegated to being a doctor. I mean, that second statistic of 95% came from brown-skinned doctors.
Yeah, okay, so what did you want to do?
I don't know. But
I wanted a good job, but instead I have to be a doctor. Okay, that's not prestigious or anything.
weird
Sorry.
complaint. But it's also just nonsense. Like, if we can get the first link up from the BBC, I mean, this is just something to remember, which is that this is just not true. Like, if we look at the law for a second, because we can all argue about what society does in the shadows that we don't know, these phantom ghosts of racism, but the law is actively discriminating against white heterosexual male people in the UK. I mean, this is just one court case that has been proven in court that the police, a government body here, did discriminate against a person who applied for being a white heterosexual male.
I remember this guy. He was phenomenally well qualified, wasn't he?
Unbelievably.
Yeah, and this was his dream, wasn't it? Because he'd been working towards it for years, and he was,
would have been a perfect pick, but he was the wrong type of genetics, and therefore they couldn't accept him. So it's just like, okay, so, I mean, even if you want to say, like, out in the ether, I believe that people discriminate against brown-skinned people because they don't want them around or something. Well, okay, but we're going to be chasing ghosts forever if we're going to deal with that. Hard data shows that, no, in the law, something we can actually do something about, sir, we have problems to deal with here.
Yeah.
And it just happens to be that it's not in the direction of yourself.
Yes.
So, and then he doesn't stop here. He has to continue going on about this. So he then says that brown people are looked over for promotion, and that's the reason they're on the front line.
I would say this is a clear example of systemic or structural racism. Whether it's employers not offering us promotion, or teachers not encouraging us to aspire to the same qualifications as white kids in our class. The existence of deep-seated attitudes within society has been curtailing opportunities for people of color for decades. And it's this systemic racism that's kept many people in those frontline jobs that expose them to the virus.
I mean, it's like dealing with a child.
Oh my God, the mythology is never going to die, is it? It's like, look, here's all the reasons for these things happening that you're upset about, and they all seem to be either within your control or something about the geographic location of your position on the earth, or something to do with your career path and choice to become a doctor and work at the NHS.
Tangible things.
Tangible things that we can point to and say, yes, that is systemic racism, I agree. We're not having the same conversation.
I must say that this is an hour long. I've had to edit it down. That part was after him talking to, I think it was his sister or something.
Yeah.
And she just mentioned in a cafe, I remember going for jobs and they'd look at you like, oh, you can speak well or something like that. It's like, you've just listened to data for like 3 interviews. And then, but your friend has said something here, and then you're like,
well, that's good enough for me.
It's like, it's pathetic. And this is state funded as well, just to anyone who's not, who's joined us late. This is the BBC.
Yeah.
And he then goes on and they just keep bashing him over the head with the data for the rest of the documentary. So this is just them saying that no, their health being a problem here is because of existing conditions and because you live in areas that are highly deprived, and therefore that's the problem here. So
patients with comorbidities were more likely to require admission to hospital than those who don't have comorbidities.
So the more healthy you are, the higher chance you have of surviving this virus.
Absolutely. Patients who present to hospital, test positive for coronavirus, are 1.8 times more likely to die if they have underlying high blood
Something
pressure.
tangible.
They're 1.7 times more likely to die if they have underlying diabetes, and twice as likely to die if they have underlying ischemic heart disease. So our underlying health has a significant bearing on our outcomes from the virus. And what we found is that patients who presented with underlying health conditions are more likely to have the most serious outcomes from coronavirus. And actually, when you go back to look at where those patients came from, they were statistically more likely to come from regions of highest deprivation.
So the people who are more likely to die have existing conditions and they live in deprived areas. And then the next clip here is him showing that deprived areas are more likely to have people who have brown skin. And that's, very easy causal link here, something you could easily make.
Yeah.
So let's just play this.
Deprivation is a very complex term. It's not just as simple as poverty and how much income you have. It's also things like what kind of housing you live in, what kind of food you eat. Yeah. One of the conditions that we know is really associated with bad outcomes with COVID is obesity. Obesity is much more prevalent in deprived areas. In fact, 36% of adults who lived in deprived areas will have obesity compared to just 21% in more affluent areas. Again, we're talking about 25% of people having diabetes if they come from a deprived area compared to 15% if you're from a more affluent area. If you're black, you are 70% more likely to live in a deprived area than white people. But it gets worse than that. If we look at the specifics, if we look at someone who's Bangladeshi...
She sounds like she's dunking.
They are 114% more likely to live in a deprived area. If you're Pakistani, you're 246% more likely to live in a deprived area than a white person.
Right, let's keep that there, because I just want to remember here that all throughout this we've mentioned all other different groups, and then all of a sudden the Indian doctor here suddenly is just talking about black, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani.
The privileged Indian doctor who's laughing, look how poor and ridiculous you are. That's how it sounds to me.
It does sound weird.
It's like, what are you doing?
But there's something here. She left out a couple of other groups, and you can guess which
Oh,
ones.
go on. What about working class?
So we're talking about deprived areas in the country, and therefore, brown people who are black and brown people who are Indian and whatnot. But when you look at just the government data, so if we can get the next link up, I just went to the government's own website on this, in which they keep information on this. And just in the main points, in 2019, people from all ethnic minority backgrounds, except the Indian, Chinese, white Irish, and white other groups, were more likely than white British to live in the most overall deprived area. So it's like, okay, so the Indians and the Chinese live in better off areas than white British as a group, and also the white Irish there.
And way above the Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, and blacks.
Yeah, so in that chart she wants to show to the British public, because I mean the states funds this, so they want to give their perspective, which is pure propaganda. Why did they suddenly exclude Chinese and Indian?
But it makes
because it wouldn't have fit the narrative.
It makes her laughing about this all the more sort of sinister, doesn't it?
Yeah, the posh Indian doctors there, like,
oh, you blacks, guess how bad your houses are. So what are you doing? That's horrible.
But the data from this, I mean, just from the clips I've shown you, like it's so easy. Like, okay, people from these communities have existing conditions, are a higher percentage. They lived in more deprived areas, except the Indians and Chinese, and therefore this is, you know, a pretty obvious causal link here. I also did check up on, apparently Chinese are now underrepresented in deaths because they're using old data for the mobility stuff, but another story. And it goes on and on like this, and they give more, you know, no data, but instead just feelings about why things are going on.
I mean, I've got some feelings about it, if we're going into the feelings thing. I mean, like, culturally, there are differences between these cultural groups. I mean, have you ever had Caribbean food?
No, actually, wait, no, there's a place down I have had it. Yeah.
Oh, well, it's amazing. It's obviously not good for you, right? It's really fatty, and it's delicious. And since I'm on keto, I can have it. If the restaurants were open, I would. But it's really delicious, but it's obviously not good for you. And if you ate this on a regular basis, you can explain the obesity rates. You know, it's like...
Pretty easy.
Yeah.
I mean, not to talk going with Bangladeshi and Pakistani there, the fact of families living in the same household. I mean, do these people want the government to come in and start dragging grandma and granddad away from these houses and putting them in the nursing homes?
Sounds awful.
Which they're killing everyone.
Andrew Cuomo can then take over. Yeah, Jesus. No.
Jesus Christ. And this isn't good enough for him to hear the data, so then he goes on, and there's...
All this data is racist.
Some lady talking about how apparently black women, when they're giving birth, might not be given drugs, but she doesn't really have any data for it, apart from the fact that she says, I think it's, what is it? Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth in the UK.
Jesus.
It's like, okay, sure, so that could be something they investigated, but that has nothing to do with COVID, mate.
Yeah.
So I don't know why you brought up this conversation. But it's like, okay, whatever. And then he decides that, no, there are better things for me to get my information. Race doctors from the US are the people he's going to get his information from.
Oh, good idea.
So he invites this American professor.
Oh, thank God. We get Americans to come and talk to us about race, finally.
Yeah. Let's play.
I understand the role that systemic racism can play in creating inequality, from jobs to living conditions to medical treatment. But there's a radical school of thought originating in the US suggesting that racism itself could be making us ill.
Weathering is what happens to your body down
through
your body systems down all the way to your cells when you live in a racist society and you are the target of that racism.
Yeah.
When you're chronically stressed, you have stress hormones going through your body over hours, years, decades. And that starts to erode your immune system. It affects everything in your body. It's not just one condition. Some people it might manifest in maternal mortality. Some people it might manifest in diabetes or obesity. So in the case of COVID-19, it's not just that Black people are more likely to get COVID, but it's that they're more likely to die from it at a younger age. And that's, I would say, very likely because of weathering.
I mean, absolute nonsense. Like, he spoke to the doctors on this who have the hard evidence, and they're like, look, they're dying more in the ICUs because they've got comorbidities.
Yeah.
And he's like, I just don't understand, doctor. Racist from America. Please tell me what's happening. Weathering.
Yeah,
it's weathering. It's like the black nationalist version of science or something.
Yeah, childless, white, single woman, academic has come along to invent some pseudoscientific term of weathering that explains how all black people are actually the constant victims of racism and therefore none of their life choices are their own fault.
Yeah, I mean, she is making the argument here that essentially because you are discriminated against or you feel stress from being discriminated against or oppressed, I think the word she would use.
You perceive this.
Yeah, and therefore you're more stressed and this is causing you to get the diabetes, which is then killing you. Therefore, racism is the real problem here. And it's like, just...
Yeah, it's not the amount of sugar you eat.
Snake oil salesman. But the fact that this is invited on as some kind of expert just shows how pathetic the attempts were. That they went looking for the data, realised this was a dead end for the BBC's race grifting, and decided, right, we'll just call in the academics to make up some infallible theory which you can't disprove because it's already nonsense.
Yeah, we'll prove it's not weathering.
How
would you do it?
It makes no
seriously,
sense.
It's unverifiable. You're unfalsifiable. You couldn't, and it's also unverifiable.
Yeah.
You can't prove it or disprove it.
So then he plays this afterwards, in which he's trying to claim that BLM are a great thing, and he says that
spreading COVID.
The government need to do something about these injustices. After listening to this woman talk about weathering, and it's just like, what do you mean injustices? There is no injustice throughout this whole thing. It is just people making their own free choices, deciding to eat unhealthily, deciding to live in an area which is lower deprived. The jobs they take.
Yeah.
I mean, if there are no laws stopping people, if there are no barriers, well, then it's not anyone's fault that they're there. So let's just play this.
2020 was an extraordinary year.
False narrative there.
COVID took a brutal toll on Britain, claiming the lives of tens of thousands of people.
So we encourage non-white
Against the
people
backdrop
to
of the
congregate
pandemic,
protests.
the murder of George Floyd created a perfect storm, exposing more clearly than ever before the deep-seated social and economic injustices faced by black communities.
The protesters on the street have shown they're no longer willing to put up with it. What I want to know is, what is our government going to do about these injustices?
I mean, again, the protesters have shown that they will not put up with it. Put up with what?
On the plus side, didn't the government make tearing down statues illegal?
I think they did, which
So
is
yeah,
good.
that's what they're going to do about it. Get wrecked.
We also love, whenever leftists riot or destroy anything, it's like, their anger is justified.
Yeah.
They won't put up with it. But if a right-winger does it, it's like, we got to
When the EDL does it, they're
Yeah.
like, ah!
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then he plays this clip of Kemi Badenoch, the queen of the UK at this point,
Yep.
quite frankly. Because
Pledge our allegiance to Kemi.
she's the only one talking sense.
Yep.
And she just gives a perfectly simple scientific breakdown. Let's play.
When Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch reported on the disparity of COVID outcomes in Britain, she acknowledged many of the issues I've explored.
The current evidence shows that it is a range of socio-economic and geographical factors, such as occupational exposure, population density, household composition, and pre-existing health conditions, which contribute to the higher infection and mortality rates for ethnic minority groups.
Perfect explanation.
Yep.
It's this. None of that is racist. It's just free choices, and there's the outcome.
And we, the government, literally can't stop you doing it either.
And what's the BBC's complaint about this? She's not saying racism. That's the complaint. Let's play.
Yet, in response to a question in the House, she actually dismissed the idea that racism had played a role.
Many people talked about their experiences of systemic racism, but the findings we've come out with do not support that.
I can't believe she could have come to this conclusion.
You've just spent weeks
No kidding.
listening to scientists and people with data telling you exactly what she's then just said. I mean, she's released a report on this. Anyone can read in their own time.
Yeah.
Showing in black and white why it is, and he's just like, I can't believe it.
I know, I can totally believe that he can't believe it.
But
I
this-
totally believe
This
it.
weird racist cat lady from America said it was weathering. So like,
Exactly.
hell, man.
He's unbelievable. It's like a religious cult.
Yeah, and then he gets to interview Kemi, which I'm just going to play the full thing. It's a little bit long, but I hope it's worth it.
Go on then.
Just her blowing him out. Let's play.
I noticed that in the 62-page quarterly report that you delivered, that there wasn't a single mention of the word racism or discrimination.
What we found was the cause of it was very much to do with underlying health conditions, socioeconomic factors, and occupational risk factors were huge. It's not the skin color that causes the problem. It's the underlying risks.
It seems like we're ignoring the systemic reasons why people of colour are being kept at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder.
So in
Talking
my
to a black
place of work,
MP.
for example,
People of colour
you
just
can
can't get ahead.
definitely see that there are people of color, as you say, doing the security work, doing the cleaning work. But when we look at the rates of employment, for instance, we're on a par with other races. You can see visibly, even in positions of power, who's editing Vogue, who's the chancellor of the exchequer. Just little things like that. You can see that there is improvement.
Are you therefore saying that there's no barriers to black and ethnic minorities kind of improving their lot in the UK?
Yes!
It's a kind of level playing
They
field.
are. The story we have
As
in
you
the
speak
country
to
is
a black
actually one of
minister.
progress.
The black
But what are the
filmmaker,
bulk of
self-made
people who
filmmaker.
are especially coming to the country
Not self-made, funded
more
by the
recently
state.
doing?
Well, okay,
I think that's a different story. You shouldn't just come here and then be stuck
Speaks
in a
to the
particular
Indian doctor
social
and the black
strata.
MP.
But what are the tools to help people move on and up? Education is an obvious tool.
But education itself does have problems within it, which prevent black children from
It's also racist.
advancing to the better colleges, better universities. So one would have to admit that there is an element of structural racism within the educational system. I just don't understand why we're not admitting that there is structural racism
Well,
within
David, why
society.
don't you tell me, what are you defining as structural
See how
racism?
bored she is with this already.
Well,
Love Kemi.
I think, personally, I
she's
think
going on the
structural
attack.
racism is when the system itself prevents a particular group of people from advancing up the social ladder.
And the black
So I agree with
MP,
you
cabinet
that those
member,
things have existed, but they are so much better. They are so much better than when you and I were at school, David. But in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, people felt it was racism. That wasn't what the evidence showed. But the fact that people feel that is itself a problem, which we need to tackle as well.
Based.
And we're not avoiding the difficult subjects, but everything has to be based on evidence. And that's the approach this government takes.
I love it. Look at that face. Like, she's literally like Richard Dawkins slapping the
Yeah,
thing, like, look, what's the evidence? Like, give me that. I mean, and especially when we're talking about something like this.
but I just love it. Black people can't get ahead, he says to the black cabinet minister. What doesn't make
Like,
sense?
the black actor says to the black cabinet minister on a show funded by the state, in which she's talking about I don't know, what ethnicity is, the chancellor who's not white as well. It's like, social mobility in the UK is not stopped by your race. I mean, just demonstrably.
I mean, I just don't even know why we have to have this conversation.
I don't know. And then he's blaming like the universities,
Which I agree with. They are definitely responsible for making everyone think about race all the time.
I mean, that's one thing. But there's something she mentions in her report that I shouldn't say here, which is Jews. Let's talk about Jews for a second. I mean, disproportionately affected in the United States.
Yeah, that's
disproportionately respected in the UK, apparently. And she makes the point to Diane Abbott in the chamber, which is just, well, why are we not talking about the system being structurally racist and anti-Semitic towards Jewish people?
God, this is going to get into a complex conversation now, isn't it?
But that's the thing. It's like, because no one cares about that. That's not useful for the Labour Party.
Well, they're not BAME,
protecting
are they?
Jews.
They're not BAME. They don't fall into BAME.
Exactly. There's something else. They're practically white men, so they're not of important. And you think, okay, this
We're going
guy's
to talk about privilege for the minute, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, we see where they're going.
So this guy's been bashed over the head endlessly with the data, and he's still got nowhere. And then he ends up talking to the Minister for Equalities. I mean, she's issued, I think it's 2 reports now, like 60-page documents explaining bit by bit. Did he learn a thing? Did he learn a thing from this hour-long documentary? Play.
I find this response so frustrating. If we can't get those in power to acknowledge the damage systemic racism is doing to the health of millions of people, then I believe we face an uphill struggle to effect positive change.
Learned nothing. Absolute dunce of the classroom.
It is literally back to sort of mythological thinking with him. Systemic racism is a grand narrative. It has to exist, and if I can't find evidence for it, well, that's just because the evidence is presumably being suppressed by racists, like Kemi Badenoch. If you enjoyed this segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can watch the full broadcast live every weekday at 1 p.m. UK time on lotuseaters.com.